Okay, thanks very much, and I'm glad to be at this forum. I look forward to both hearing and finding out from John Miller another aspect of how we can all work together on this common problem. I'm Errol Lewis. I work at New York One News. I also host a podcast called You Decide, and it's mostly about politics, but it's sort of politics plus. And I only bring that up to say that one of our episodes, if you want to hear at length, I have a long discussion with John Miller about a lot of different things, including his illustrious background, how he interviewed Osama bin Laden in 1998, and all kinds of other stuff. But we'll leave that for another time.
We have 15 minutes.
Yeah, and we'll make the best use of it. So tell me, actually, just to...
So let me begin. I was born in a small house.
No. Your days as a journalist are absolutely fascinating, but tell people, what is it that the Counterintelligence and the Intelligence Division, you run both of them, what do they do, and talk a little bit about their scope. You're in multiple countries, you've got a lot of people that you work with.
Sure, so the Intelligence Bureau and the Counterterrorism Bureau are linked under one deputy commissioner, and there's a chief for both. But the Intelligence Bureau starts with its name, which is gathering intelligence. So what's the information out there about criminal activity, about terrorist activity? Then it goes to analysis, that's a lot of information to look like when you have a target the size of New York. So we have very talented analysts who boil down to, okay, here's the intelligence, what does it mean? Where do we have to point towards with that? And then it ends at the logical place, which is prevention, which is, can you figure out who the actors are, what the plans are, what the groups are in terms of violence, and can you stop it before it occurs? The Counterterrorism Bureau picks up right there. We end with prevention and intelligence. We start in counterterrorism with prevention. All of those police officers you see out there with the vests and the helmets and the long guns at high-profile locations that may come up in that day's intelligence stream as similar to another target or a place where we want to put a foot forward. That's part of prevention. The second thing is preparedness, which is, do we have the right people? Do they have the right training? Do we have the right equipment? Do we have the right vehicles? Do we have the right response capabilities? Are we prepared if intelligence fails? And sometimes it will. We've prevented in excess of 40 different plots or planned attacks against New York City since 9/11. That's a great batting average, but we also had 3 terrorist attacks within 18 months between 2017 and 18. The West Side Highway truck attack, the suicide bomber in the subway, the Chelsea bombing. So you're not going to prevent everything, and that gets to the third piece of counterterrorism, which is the response. On the idea that intelligence fails and we have to respond, is our response effective? That's how those two bureaus come together.
And you have roughly how many men and women in those bureaus?
So I think you're talking about, between the two bureaus, 1,500 people. 500 of them are those cops you see out in the street front and center. There's hundreds in intelligence who you see, well, who you don't see because they're behind the scenes. But that's how you prevent 40 plots.
And you also have folks in London and in Cairo and other places around the world.
We have 14 overseas posts. We've got people in London and Paris, but we've also got people in Abu Dhabi and Jordan, Tel Aviv. We have people in Australia and Madrid. And we tend to go to places where there are different languages, foreign cultures, strange customs. So we have a detective assigned to Los Angeles. But for a foreign post, Los Angeles covers LA and Las Vegas, where you see a lot of crossover between New York, New Yorkers in general, traveling back and forth, but also criminal activity.
And these are folks who are not necessarily out foiling plots in those locations. They're there to convey information back to you about whether or not there might be a New York connection you need to be worried about.
And that's what it is. So if there's a terrorist attack in Madrid, for instance, and there has been, Manny Pombo, the NYPD detective in Madrid, is pushing back information, which is, this is the group involved. Do they have a New York Nexus? These are the players involved. Do they have New York connections? Is there communications between these people in New York? So our first job is protect New York. Our second job is what intel do we have that we can share back with that department in tandem with the FBI and the Joint Terrorism Task Force, so that that circle of information is a continuum between partners, because we're facing the same threat on a globalized scale.
So now, with that background, where does gun violence fit in? Is it an adjunct? I mean, I imagine in the course of learning about and foiling some of these plots, you'll find people who have a lot of weapons, and they may have come out of the illegal market or the legal market. How does that connect up for you?
So what's not widely known, because we always talk about terrorism, is that 60% of what we do on the Intelligence Bureau side is criminal. Criminal intelligence, analysis, criminal activity. So if you take the numbers now, there's about 106 field intelligence officers. That's the intelligence officer that's, right here in the 13th precinct or Midtown South, or also in the 75th precinct in East New York, Brooklyn, or in the 103 in Jamaica, Queens. And that intelligence officer, of course, is trained and attuned to look for indicators of terrorism. But their daily bread and butter is indications of the ability to prevent violence and solve crimes where violence has occurred. Now, today, you look at that program, and I think my numbers from this morning show, year to date, they have taken 1,230 guns off the street. There's been a lot of discussion about stop and frisk. If you look at stop, question, and frisk, at the height of it, they stopped 750,000 people and came up with 900 guns. I can't do the math, but that's a sign of a statistical failure if you're stopping 700 people and coming up with under 1,000 guns. The idea that these intelligence officers can debrief suspects, find out information about where weapons are, who has guns, who's carrying a gun right now, go to a prosecutor, add like a layer of legal process there. Okay, I have this informant who's been reliable in the past who gives us this information. I swear to that on an affidavit. They sign out a search warrant. That goes before a judge. He okays it. Now you've wrapped a lot of legal process around it, but we're getting more guns that way than you did the other way, which was vastly affecting communities of color and vastly affecting trust between the NYPD and those communities. And those communities are vastly affected by gun violence. The 2018 numbers told us that 72% of our victims were in community of color, and 72% of our suspects were too. So there was a disproportionate effect that should drive an effort towards reducing the presence of guns and gun violence there. But I think the Intelligence Bureau is a large contributor to doing it in a more effective way. It's what we call precision policing. I'll borrow medical terms for the room. Why do massive chemo and radiation when you can identify the smaller area and use laser surgery? That's the theory we go by.
So if you were able to, well, in effect, what you've just described is you're trying to intercept these guns and break up the dealer networks and so forth, prevent the violence, kind of in the last mile, right? Is it possible, I guess by analogy to your 14 overseas bureaus, to station people in Georgia, in Virginia, elsewhere down the iron pipeline, and try and get more intelligence and ability to counteract it closer to the source?
So we work with ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. And what you're looking at, as you describe it, Errol, is the straw buyer. They go down there with no criminal record. They live down there and they have a cousin. They'll buy half a dozen guns, wait a couple weeks, buy half a dozen more, and then drive that up. That's the iron pipeline. So when we recover a gun and we go to ATF and we do a trigger lock case, we're going to take that federal, they'll go back to that store. They'll look at that form. They'll look at the history of that gun buyer, about how many trips to that store, how many different weapons. They'll go and, from a compliance standpoint, say, can you account for all these weapons? When you have someone who's bought a dozen guns and you get to the house in Georgia, in Ohio, in North Carolina, and they say, yeah, I don't know where any of those are. Now you have a straw buyer case. But it's a little bit like the Dutch boy trying to, put his finger in the dike to plug the leaks. There's a lot of iron traveling in that iron pipeline. One of the great debates that we struggle with in the Intelligence Bureau is we can do those cases. We can go undercover. I can find my guy Errol. I can say, can you get me guns? But if I'm giving you thousands of dollars and you're going down and getting guns, am I your only customer? Am I the one who's causing you to make the trip where you're going to get guns for me and somebody else? Am I stopping guns from coming in or causing more? So we try to do a mix of these, along with programs like Ceasefire, where it's not about getting the guns, it's about getting to the gangs and giving them a reality check about where this is going and what life could be like or what the alternatives are. And that's where the healthcare community comes into it.
Well, I was going to say, what would you recommend as a way to integrate your efforts with what the folks in this room do?
So under the Ceasefire Program, not an Intelligence Bureau program, it comes in the self-explanatory named division of collaborative policing. That's where they'll get 20 gang members from a named crew in one of these neighborhoods. We have deployments now in Staten Island, in Brooklyn, and in the Bronx. Crime is at its lowest levels in history in New York, yet we're going to be up 20 some odd shootings, 20 some odd murders in a city of 8.6 million people. If you're coming in under 300 murders and under 1,000 shootings, we'll probably be in the 800 area again this year. That's a wild success. So an increase of 20 here or 20 there is statistically insignificant. But it can't be insignificant if you're the mom, if you're the brother, if you're the sister, if you're the shooting victim who narrowly misses being the homicide victim. So we attach a lot of significance to even these tiny increases. We'll bring in the gang. We'll use the leverage of probation or parole. Because, when you invite a street gang or a crew in, they're not going to show up because they really want to meet with the police and the community and shoot the
help out a little bit. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we'll bring them in, and the police will talk. We know who you guys are. You know who we are. Look on the wall. That's all the shooting victims from this area here, and that's all the people who are dead. For everybody up there, there's a mom, there's a dad, there's a brother, there's a sister. You know these people. And you may know something about these things, but that's not why we're here. And then, they will pass it to the district attorney who will say, we've identified your crew. We know the shootings you're behind and the beef you're having with this other crew. This needs to stop. So that means when you get arrested, or you get arrested, or you get arrested on that charge where you're going to get a plea deal and you're going to walk out, there's no plea deal. That then goes to the inspiration piece from, a local clergy who will say, I know you, and I know your parents, and this is the effect I am tired of burying children that I christened. And then it will go to the former gang member who say, I am you, I've been you, and you don't need to end up where I ended up. Then it'll go to the federal prosecutor who will say, you don't want to see me, because my friend, the district attorney, is a very good man or woman. But if I get you with this weapon, and you're a prior convicted felon, or you have a defaced serial number, anything that qualifies as that case, or you're in that shooting, you're going away to some prison in I don't know where. Maybe New Mexico, maybe Kansas, but don't expect visits, and you're going to be away for a long time. So it's kind of a reality check, where then it goes to the social service piece. And that's where the healthcare community comes in a broad sense, which is, what do you need? Do you need counseling? Probably not. Do you need a job? Probably so. Can we hook you up? We can do it. Do you need housing? Is this the environment? Do you need to get out of here and get into public housing somewhere else? We can do an emergency switch. Here's a card. This card, to people who are part of the Ceasefire Program, you get this card. When you call this number, somebody will answer. And if you tell them, this is what I'm looking for, we will get you hooked up. So that's a very different approach. 106 field intelligence officers and their teams are out there doing very dangerous work. You're going after people who you already know have that gun, and you probably already know that because they are shooters. Statistically, our shooters and our shooting victims, which is the other healthcare crossover, are the same people. Something like more than half of our shooting victims are suspects in shootings, and vice versa. These are the same crews shooting back and forth at each other. So, you know, we try to create opportunity to excise yourself from a path where there's a high potential of nothing good coming out of it, and get you towards social services, medical services, housing services, job services. In the meantime, we're also out there targeting the people that we know have the weapons and we know are about to use them.
Okay.
I have to throw in one more thing, which
Yes.
is the domestic violence piece. The current police commissioner, back when he was crime control strategy, said, all of these cases where we arrest somebody in a domestic violence case and then we go back to that victim, what do we know about the gun in the home? Because we've had arrests where the victim then backs out of being the complainant, which is not uncommon in those cases, and 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, a month later, we're there on a shooting homicide. Why didn't we know about that gun? So the debriefings we're doing with domestic violence victims includes, is there a gun in the house? Does he have a gun? Have you seen a gun? And we'll write that up in a search warrant. We'll go get that gun. Now, that may mean that that person is going to be out of the house. It's going to reduce the violence for a time because they could be locked up for the gun. Or it may simply mean that they bail out and they come back home, and whatever happens, happens. But in our last panel, we talked about the availability of the gun being a catalyst for suicide, murder, assault, accidents. Removing that gun from a home where we've already seen domestic violence has become a key thing. And I look at our domestic violence guns, that's a good part of this number. It's 60 or 70, you know, that we take out every year. That's 60 or 70 homicides that might have happened 2 weeks later, but you've removed that from the environment.
Okay. That brings us to the end of our time. I would just remind everybody that the NYPD is everywhere. You've got detectives all over the place, and localized efforts to dovetail with some of what the Deputy Commissioner talked about, I think would be welcome and effective. Thanks very much, John.
Thank you, Errol.